Every Friday, my husband stayed late at work, but one day his colleague sent me a photo of another woman sitting on his lap. I recognized my best friend. That same evening, I did this. Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think I had the kind of marriage other women envied, not in a showy way. We weren't the couple with the matching vacation photos and the coordinated outfits. Daniel and I were something quieter than that, something I believed was more real. We had a house in a suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio, with a front porch I repainted every spring and a backyard where we grilled on Sundays. We had inside jokes that went back 11 years. We had a daughter, Sophie, who was 8 years old and obsessed with dinosaurs and strawberry ice cream, in that order. We had a life. I worked as an administrative coordinator for a mid-sized healthcare company. Daniel was a project manager at a civil engineering firm. We weren't rich, but we were steady. We split the grocery runs and the school pickups. He made coffee every morning without being asked. I ironed his shirts on Thursdays because he always forgot until the last minute. That was us. Functional, familiar, comfortable in the way that only a decade of shared life can make two people. Melissa had been my best friend since college. We met freshman year in a statistics class we both nearly failed, and we'd been close ever since. She was the maid of honor at my wedding. She was in the delivery room when Sophie was born. She knew every argument Daniel and I had ever had, every insecurity I'd ever whispered out loud, every crack in the foundation of my marriage that I'd tried to plaster over with patience and love. I trusted her the way you trust someone who has held your hand through the worst moments of your life. That trust, I would come to understand, was the most dangerous thing I owned. The first signs were small. Aren't they always? Daniel started staying late on Fridays. Not every Friday at first, maybe once a month in the spring, then twice a month through the summer. He always had a reason, a deadline, a city contract review, a site inspection report that couldn't wait until Monday. He worked in infrastructure. I knew the projects could be demanding. I didn't question it the first few times. I heated up dinner and left a plate in the oven and fell asleep before he got home. But then it became every Friday, without exception. And something about the consistency of it started to feel off to me. Not because consistency is suspicious on its own, but because Daniel had never been a consistent man. He forgot anniversaries. He double-booked weekends. He once showed up to Sophie's school play on the wrong night. The fact that he suddenly had one unwavering commitment, one night a week that never moved, never got canceled, never got replaced. That specificity felt wrong in a way I couldn't name yet. I mentioned it to him once lightly over dinner. "You've been at the office every Friday lately," I said. "Big project?" He didn't look up from his plate. "The Henderson Bridge contract. It's a mess. You know how government timelines are." I did know, or I thought I did. I let it go. What I couldn't let go of was Melissa. Around the same time Daniel's Fridays became sacred, Melissa became harder to reach. We used to talk at least twice a week. Sometimes just quick calls during lunch, sometimes long conversations on Sunday evenings, while our families did their own things. But her responses started coming slower. Texts she used to answer in minutes started going hours without a reply. She canceled 2 plans in a row: a birthday dinner for a mutual friend and a Saturday afternoon coffee we'd scheduled 3 weeks in advance. Her excuses were thin. She seemed distracted the few times we did speak. I told myself she was going through something and that I should give her space. I gave her space. What I didn't realize was that the space I was giving her was the space she was filling with my husband. How do you describe the feeling of something being wrong when you can't yet say what it is? It's like a sound just below the register of hearing. You feel it in your chest before your ears can catch it. I felt it every Friday night when I sat alone in that living room with the TV on and the volume too low. I felt it when I called Melissa and her voicemail picked up. I felt it in the way Daniel kissed me hello when he finally came home. Quick, distracted, aimed at my cheek like a formality. I told myself I was imagining things. And then, on a Thursday evening in October, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize. There was no text, just a photo. I opened it in the kitchen, standing next to the stove where soup was still simmering. The image was dark, taken inside what looked like a bar. Low lighting, wooden tables, a neon sign glowing in the background. I could make out Daniel's profile immediately. His gray jacket, the one I'd bought him 2 birthdays ago. His posture, slightly slouched the way he always sat when he'd had a drink. And in his lap, laughing, her head tilted back and her hand resting on his chest. Melissa. I recognized her before I could stop myself. The way you recognize someone you've known half your life. Not just their face, but the shape of them, the way they hold their body, the specific angle of a laugh you've heard 1,000 times. The soup boiled over. I didn't move to turn it off. I just stood there in my own kitchen, in the house I repainted every spring, holding my phone with both hands, and felt 11 years of my life rearrange themselves into something I didn't recognize at all. The soup made a mess of the stovetop. I cleaned it up. I don't know how long I stood there before my body moved on its own and my hands reached for the dishcloth, but at some point they did. I wiped the burner. I turned off the flame. I put the lid on the pot. I did all of it mechanically, the way you do things when the thinking part of your brain has gone somewhere else entirely. Sophie was upstairs doing homework. I could hear her moving around. The creak of her chair, the occasional thump of a book dropped on the floor, the faint sound of her talking to herself the way she did when she was working through a math problem. I stood at the bottom of the stairs and listened to her for a moment. 8 years old. Dinosaurs and strawberry ice cream. I went to the bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the tub. I cried. Not the quiet, dignified kind of crying you see in movies. I mean the ugly, airless kind that bends you forward and takes your breath. I pressed a towel against my face so Sophie wouldn't hear me. I gave myself 10 minutes. I counted them on my watch. When the 10 minutes were up, I washed my face with cold water. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. My eyes were red. My jaw was set. I looked like someone I'd never quite met before. I went back downstairs. I gave Sophie her dinner. I listened to her tell me about a Triceratops fact she'd learned in science class. I nodded and asked follow-up questions and laughed at the right moments. I put her to bed at 8:30. I read her 2 chapters of the book we'd been working through together. Then I went to the living room and I sat in the dark and I let myself think. The first thing I felt, past the grief, past the shock, was fear. Real, cold, practical fear. Not the dramatic kind, but the kind that settles into your stomach like a stone and makes you think about logistics. Because this wasn't just a betrayal. This was my entire life. The house was in both our names. Our finances were shared. Sophie's school, her routine, her sense of home. All of that was threaded through this marriage. If I reacted badly, if I made a scene or confronted Daniel that night without thinking, I could lose everything I'd spent a decade building. I could become the hysterical wife. I could be painted as unstable, as difficult, as the problem. I had watched it happen to other women. I knew how quickly the story got rewritten, so I didn't confront him that night. When Daniel came home at nearly 11, another late Friday, I was in bed, pretending to be asleep. I heard him move through the house, heard the faint sounds of him in the kitchen, the bathroom, and then the careful way he got into bed, trying not to wake me. I lay still. I kept my breathing even. And while I listened to him fall asleep beside me, I started to build a plan. I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't an investigator. I was an administrative coordinator who had spent years keeping a household running on time and under budget. But those aren't small skills. I knew how to organize information. I knew how to read documents. I knew how to track things. I knew how to wait. The first thing I needed was evidence. Real evidence. Not just one photograph sent by an anonymous number. That photo was a starting point, but it wasn't enough. Who had sent it? Why? Was it someone from Daniel's office who had a conscience, or someone with their own agenda? I saved the image to a private folder on my phone and screenshotted the number. I would look into it later. The second thing I needed was to understand where I stood financially. I knew the basics: our joint account, the mortgage, Daniel's salary, mine. But I didn't know the details, and details mattered. Were there accounts I didn't know about? Had money been moved? Had he been spending it on her? I needed to pull our financial records going back at least a year. I worked in healthcare administration. I understood documentation. I understood what a paper trail looked like. I would build one. The third thing, and this one sat heaviest in my chest, was a lawyer. I needed to speak to a divorce attorney before Daniel had any idea I was considering it, if it came to that. And I was beginning to understand, lying there in the dark next to a man I no longer recognized, that it was almost certainly going to come to that. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark and thought with a clarity that surprised me. The grief was still there. It sat behind everything like a dull roar. But it wasn't running the show. Something cooler had taken over. Something focused. By the time pale gray light started coming through the curtains, I had a list in my head, not written down. Not yet, that would come later. But clear and ordered. Step 1. Document everything quietly and without alerting Daniel. Step 2. Consult a divorce attorney alone in confidence. Step 3. Trace the anonymous sender and determine what they knew. Step 4. Before any confrontation, make sure I was protected. I got up. I made the coffee. I helped Sophie get ready for school. And I smiled at my husband over the breakfast table like I always did. He had no idea the woman sitting across from him was no longer the same. I called in a personal day that Monday. I told Daniel I wasn't feeling well. He looked mildly concerned, touched my forehead the way you touch a child's, said, "Drink water," and left for work. I watched his car back out of the driveway from the kitchen window. Then I went to my home office, closed the door, and opened my laptop. I'd done research over the weekend, quietly, during the hours Daniel was watching football and Sophie was playing in the yard. I'd searched for family law attorneys in Columbus with good reviews and no obvious connections to anyone I knew. I found 3 names. I called the first one that Monday morning. Her name was Patricia Holloway. Her receptionist told me she had a cancellation that Wednesday afternoon. I took it. In the days before the appointment, I worked. I went through our joint bank statements going back 14 months, printing them at the office on my lunch break, so there was no record at home. What I found wasn't dramatic. There was no single large transfer, no obvious cash drain. But there were patterns. dinner charges at restaurants I'd never been invited to, a hotel in downtown Columbus on a Saturday night last March when Daniel had told me he was at a colleague's bachelor weekend in Cincinnati. Small amounts that individually meant nothing, but together told a story. I photographed every statement with my phone. I stored them in a cloud folder I created under an email address Daniel didn't know existed. I also went back through my own memory of Melissa. It was a particular kind of pain doing that, taking every interaction from the past year and turning it over like a stone to see what was underneath. The times she'd asked casually how things were going with Daniel and me. The times she'd subtly pressed on our disagreements. "Are you two doing okay?" He seemed distant when I saw him at your birthday. I had taken those questions as the concern of a close friend. Now I understood they were reconnaissance. She had been watching us, measuring the distance between us, looking for an opening. How long had it been going on? That question kept surfacing, ugly and relentless. Months? A year? Longer? I didn't know yet, but I would find out. Wednesday came. I drove to Patricia Holloway's office on my lunch break and sat in a quiet, neutral room across from a woman in her late 50s, with reading glasses on a chain and a legal pad in front of her. I told her everything. The photograph, the financial discrepancies, the pattern of behavior. She listened without interruption. She asked precise, practical questions. She did not look shocked, and somehow that was the most steadying thing about her. She had heard this before. She knew exactly what it was. "Before you do anything else," she said, "I want you to keep documenting. Don't change your behavior toward him. Don't confront him. Don't tell anyone who might tell him. You want to control the timing of this." I told her I understood. I left her office with a folder of intake paperwork, a retainer agreement, and a list of additional documentation she'd need. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 3 minutes. Then I drove back to work and finished the afternoon like nothing had happened. Meanwhile, and I only learned this later, piecing it together from conversations and context, Daniel had noticed something. Not the evidence gathering, not the attorney visit. He noticed me. I had gone quiet in a way that wasn't my usual quiet. I wasn't cold to him. I was careful not to be. I still made dinner, still asked about his day, still sat next to him on the couch in the evenings. But there was something in me that had withdrawn, something behind my eyes that was no longer fully present with him in the room, and Daniel, for all his faults, had known me for 11 years. He mentioned it to Melissa. She told me this months later, in a moment when she was trying to justify herself. He'd texted her, "Something's off with Claire. She's being weird. Quiet." Melissa had told him he was probably overthinking it, that I was probably just tired or stressed about work. But she'd started to wonder, too. She had called me twice that week. I answered, kept the conversations brief and warm, gave her nothing. I could hear her probing, gently, for information. "How are things? How's Daniel? You seem a little flat. Are you okay?" And I gave her cheerful, empty answers that told her precisely nothing. I was learning to perform, and I was better at it than I'd expected. The real break came on a Friday evening, 3 weeks after I'd first received the photograph. I had traced the anonymous number by then. It belonged to a man named Greg Sauer, a junior project manager at Daniel's firm, who had apparently decided that whatever was happening had gone on long enough and someone should know. I'd texted him carefully, from my own number, simply saying, "I received something from this phone. I want you to know I'm handling it." He'd responded within an hour. "I'm sorry. I thought you should know. I have more if you need it." I met Greg for coffee on a Friday morning, at a place neither of us had ever been with Daniel. He was 32, uncomfortable, clearly conflicted about being there. He put his phone on the table and showed me what he had. 6 months of photographs, not just the one bar photo, a parking garage, a restaurant, outside her apartment, and then one more. A screenshot of a text exchange between Daniel and Melissa, forwarded to Greg by someone else at the firm who'd accidentally seen it on Daniel's screen during a meeting. "Does she know?" Melissa had written. "She doesn't know anything," Daniel had replied. "She never will." I looked at that message for a long moment. Then I thanked Greg, told him I would not involve him further unless absolutely necessary, and walked out into the October air. She never will. He was wrong about that. He had been wrong about that for quite some time. I went home that Friday and I filed the paperwork. Not in the symbolic sense. Patricia had been preparing the petition for 2 weeks, building it around the documentation I'd collected. That afternoon, after coffee with Greg, I called her and said 3 words. "We're ready. Go." The divorce petition was filed with the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas the following Tuesday morning. Daniel was formally served at his office on Wednesday at 10:45 a.m. I know the exact time because the process server sent me a confirmation text. I was at work when it happened. I sat at my desk and felt my phone buzz in my pocket, and I looked at the notification. And for a long moment, I just breathed. 11 years. A house with a porch I repainted every spring. A little girl who loved dinosaurs. All of it cracking open along a fault line that had been there longer than I'd known. Then I put my phone back in my pocket and finished the report I was working on. Daniel called me 6 times before noon. I didn't answer. I texted him once. "I'll be home at 6. We can talk then." He texted back 4 times, each one slightly more urgent than the last. The last one read, "Claire, this is a mistake. Please just call me." I put my phone face down on my desk. He was home when I got there. He was standing in the kitchen with the petition on the counter in front of him, and he looked like someone had physically struck him. His face was doing something I'd never seen it do before. A kind of scrambling, a reaching for the right expression that he couldn't quite land on. "You filed for divorce," he said. "Yes," I said. Without talking to me, He stopped. "Claire, where is this coming from?" I put my bag down on the chair by the door. I looked at him steadily. I had prepared for this conversation, but preparation had not made it painless. It had only made it possible. "I know about Melissa," I said. The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. He didn't deny it immediately, which told me everything about the state of his conscience. He stood very still for about 4 seconds. Then he said, "It's not what you think." "I have 6 months of photographs," I said. "I have your text messages. I have credit card records. Please don't tell me what I think." He sat down. I watched him process it. Then came the part I'd also been prepared for. The apology, the pleading, the sudden remembering that he loved me, that it was a mistake, that it meant nothing, that Melissa had pursued him, that he'd been going through something, that we could get through this. He cried. He reached for my hand. He said Sophie's name twice. I did not sit down. I did not take his hand. "The petition is filed," I said. "Patricia Holloway is my attorney. You should get one." I took Sophie to my mother's for the night. I didn't want her in the house. What I hadn't anticipated was Melissa. She showed up the following evening. Not to our house, but to my mother's, which meant Daniel had told her where I was. She rang the doorbell, and my mother opened it without knowing what she was walking into. I came to the door and found Melissa standing on the front step in a coat I'd always liked, looking at me with an expression I didn't know how to read. "I need to talk to you," she said. "No," I said. "Claire, please." "You stood in my delivery room," I said. My voice came out very flat, very quiet. You held my daughter when she was 3 hours old. She flinched. Good. I know, she said. I know, I'm sorry. But I need you to understand that what you're doing with the lawyer, the petition, this is going to hurt you too. You know that. The house, custody, everything you've built. Are you threatening me right now? I asked. I'm telling you the truth, she said, as your friend. You are not my friend, I said. You haven't been for a long time. Please don't come to my mother's house again. I closed the door. She knocked twice more. I didn't answer. Eventually, she left, but it wasn't over. 3 days later, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. A man who identified himself as speaking on Daniel's behalf, suggesting that if I pursued the divorce aggressively, certain information about my own behavior might surface. He was vague about the details, which meant they were fabricated. I recorded the call and forwarded it to Patricia. She told me this constituted attempted intimidation and that she would be noting it in our case documentation. They're scared, she said. That's why they're doing this. They were scared. And they should have been. I spent the next 4 days at my mother's house. I slept. I let my mother feed me. I played card games with Sophie in the evenings and told her that Mom and Dad were figuring some things out and that she was loved and safe, which was true. I cried twice, once in the shower, once late at night in the guest room. Both times I let myself feel it completely, and then I put it down. I was not finished, not even close. I returned home on a Tuesday. Sophie went back to school. I went back to work. I walked through the front door of the house that was still half his on paper, and I set my bag down in the hallway and looked at the rooms I had lived in for 8 years as though I were appraising them. Clinically, without sentiment. I noted what would need to be divided. I noted what mattered to me and what didn't. Daniel had moved his things to the guest room without being asked. I wasn't sure if that was guilt or calculation, but either way, I was grateful for it. For the first week, he was careful around me. He was quiet in the mornings. He said please and thank you. He made coffee and left a cup on the counter for me without comment, the way he always had. And there was something about that particular gesture, the persistence of an old habit after everything had changed, that hit me somewhere undefended and had to be deliberately set aside. I set it aside. On a Thursday evening, 11 days after the petition was filed, he knocked on the open door of the living room where I was sitting with a book I wasn't really reading. "Can I talk to you?" he said. "You can try," I said. He sat down across from me. He looked tired, genuinely, visibly exhausted, the kind of tired that comes from sleeping badly for 2 weeks. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking. He said he understood why I'd done what I'd done. He said that he had made the worst mistake of his life, and that he knew that, and that he also knew he had no right to ask anything of me, but that Sophie deserved 2 parents in the same house, and that we had 11 years, and that people came back from this. He said he was willing to go to counseling, to do whatever I needed, to cut off all contact with Melissa completely, if I would just consider— "Daniel," I said. He stopped. "I've already considered it," I said. I considered it for 3 weeks before I filed. I considered it very carefully. And I filed," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and stood up, and left the room. I heard him go upstairs. I heard the guest room door close. I went back to my book. What I want to be clear about, because I've been asked this many times in the months that followed, is that there was no part of me that was cold. Cold implies the absence of feeling. What I had was something different, a kind of clarity that had come through the feeling and out the other side. The grief was still there. The loss of what I'd thought I had was enormous and real. But it was not going to make my decisions for me, It was around that same time that I started talking to other people. I'd been isolated with this for weeks, by design, by necessity, and the isolation had served its purpose. But I was beginning to understand that I needed people who weren't Daniel, weren't Melissa, weren't my mother, who loved me without reservation, but whose advice tended toward endurance over action. I needed people who had actually been through something like this. My coworker Diane was the first person I told. She was 51, divorced for 6 years, sharp-tongued and practically unshockable. I told her over lunch one Wednesday in the break room, not dramatically, just the facts, plainly. She listened. She did not look surprised. "The best friend," she said. "They always pick someone inside the perimeter." She gave me the name of a therapist she'd used during her own divorce. She also gave me the name of a women's support group that met on Thursday evenings at a community center near my neighborhood. Not a therapy group, just women who had been through family court and knew the landscape. She said they'd been invaluable to her, practically speaking. I went the following Thursday. There were 8 women in the room. They ranged in age from 30 to 60-something. Some were mid-process, some were years out. They drank coffee from paper cups and talked about things like custody hearing preparation, asset documentation, the particular psychological wear of sharing a home with someone you were divorcing. They were not dramatic about it. They were practical. They had been through it, and they knew the terrain. I listened mostly that first night, but I came back the next week. I also started seeing the therapist Diane had recommended, a woman named Dr. Karen Reeves, who had a quiet office and a habit of asking questions that didn't seem important until 2 days later when the answer hit you in the middle of doing something ordinary. She told me, in our second session, that the combination of grief and strategic clarity I was describing was not contradictory. That functioning under pressure was not the same as suppressing feeling. That I was, in her assessment, processing this in a healthy way. "You'd be surprised," she said, "how often people don't." I was building something, not just a legal case, though that too, but a structure around myself. Diane, Dr. Reeves, the Thursday group, Patricia. A small network of women who understood what this was and what it required. I was not going through it alone anymore, and the difference that made to my steadiness was something I hadn't fully anticipated. Meanwhile, I was aware that Daniel and Melissa were watching me. Not literally, but in the way people watch someone they're uncertain about, waiting to see what I'd do next, trying to read the situation. They had tried the apology approach. They had tried the intimidation approach. Neither had moved me. I knew they weren't done. People like that are never done. I waited steadily to see what they would try next. They came together on a Saturday afternoon in November. I should have expected it. The joint approach, the coordinated front. Separately, they had failed. So they arrived together. Daniel texting me 40 minutes beforehand to say he was bringing someone who wanted to speak with me, that it was important, that he was asking me to hear them out. I knew before the doorbell rang who the someone was. I let them in because Sophie was at my mother's, and I was not afraid of 2 people I had already survived. Melissa looked different than she had on my mother's doorstep. That time, she'd looked shaken. Now, she'd composed herself. Careful clothing, careful expression, the particular look of someone who had rehearsed what they were about to say. She sat across from me on the sofa. Daniel sat beside her. I noticed he'd chosen to sit beside her rather than near me, and I thought, at least we're being honest about the geometry now. "Claire," Melissa began, "I want to start by saying, I know I hurt you. I know that what we did, what I did, was a fundamental betrayal of your trust, and I'm not here to minimize that." She paused, as though waiting for me to acknowledge her contrition. I didn't. "But I'm here because I'm worried about you," she continued. "About what this process is doing to you. The legal battle, the cost of it, the stress. You're putting yourself through an enormous amount of pain. And for what? To punish us? That's not going to heal you, Claire. It's not going to give you back what you lost." I watched her. I kept my face neutral. "The house could be yours," Daniel said. He leaned forward slightly. "I've been talking to my attorney. We could work out an arrangement without going to court. Something that protects Sophie, keeps the costs down, lets us both move forward without a war. But if you keep pushing this the way you're pushing it, it's going to get expensive and ugly, and Sophie is going to be caught in the middle of it." Sophie's name again. They had clearly decided that was the pressure point. "We're thinking of Sophie," Melissa said. Her voice had taken on a softer quality, almost sorrowful. "We both are. And we're thinking of you. Dragging this through court, all the things that are going to come out, all the ways it's going to be picked apart. Is that really what you want Sophie to grow up knowing? Is that the story you want her to have about her family?" I let her finish. Then I said, "Can I ask you something?" They both looked at me. "Did you talk to Sophie before or after you started sleeping with her father?" Melissa went still. "Because you were her godmother," I said. "You've known her since she was born. And I'm curious whether that factored into your thinking at any point, or whether that was simply a complication you decided not to consider." "Claire, I'm not angry," I said. And it was almost true. I want to be very clear about that. I'm not standing here in a rage. I'm sitting here completely clear-headed, and I'm telling you both that I appreciate you coming today, and I understand what you're trying to do, and it isn't going to work. Daniel's jaw tightened. "We're trying to protect Sophie." "No," I said. "You're trying to protect yourselves from the consequences of what you chose to do. You're trying to get me to sign something that looks fair but benefits you in a room without my attorney, under the guise of sparing our daughter trauma. And I want you to know that I see that, exactly, with complete clarity." Melissa dropped the soft voice. "You're being vindictive." "I'm being precise," I said. "There's a difference." "If you push this," Daniel said, and his tone had changed, less pleading now, harder, "things are going to come out in court that you're not going to enjoy. Things about you. I'm just telling you that." "I know you are," I said calmly. "Your representative told me the same thing on the phone 2 weeks ago. Patricia has that recording. Feel free to follow through." Silence. Melissa stood up. She had dropped the softness entirely now, and what was underneath it was something I recognized. Something I'd seen glimpses of over the years and never fully understood until now. It was contempt. Not for Daniel. For me. It had probably always been there, buried under the language of friendship. "You think you're so together," she said. "You always have. Standing there with your little plan, your little lawyer, your little—" "Melissa," Daniel said quietly. She stopped. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door without looking at me again. Daniel stood more slowly. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't fully categorize, somewhere between remorse and resentment, which was probably the most honest thing I'd ever seen on his face. "I'll have my attorney call Patricia," he said. "That's all I've ever wanted," I said. He left. I closed the door behind them, and then I stood in my hallway alone and felt, yes, a real physical shiver of fear. Not the abstract fear of losing things, the more specific fear of what people do when they're cornered. Melissa's face when the mask came off. Daniel's voice when it went hard. I stood with that fear for a minute. I let it move through me, and then I picked up my phone and called Patricia. I told her what had happened, every word I could remember. She said, "Good. Document it. All of it. Date, time, who said what. This is useful." I sat down at my desk and I wrote it all down, every word, in a plain document that I saved to my private cloud folder. The fear was still there. But it had turned into something else. Something hard and sure at the center of me. They had shown me who they were. Again. And every time they showed me that, I became a little more certain that I was doing exactly the right thing. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in February. Franklin County, courtroom 14B, 9 a.m. I had been preparing for it with Patricia for 2 months, not just emotionally, but structurally. Every piece of documentation organized, indexed, cross-referenced. Every date verified. Every claim supported by at least 2 forms of evidence. Patricia had been practicing family law for 22 years, and she told me, 2 days before the hearing, that she had rarely seen a case this thoroughly documented by a non-attorney client. "They're going to try to make you seem calculating," she said. "Like the fact that you planned this makes you the problem." "I know," I said. "Let them," she said. "Calculated preparation is not a character flaw. We'll let the documents speak." I woke up that Thursday at 5:30. I got Sophie ready for school, dropped her at my mother's, who would take her in, drove home, changed into the dark gray suit I'd bought specifically for this and had hung on the closet door the night before, and drove to the courthouse. I arrived 20 minutes early. I sat in the car in the parking structure and I thought about nothing in particular. Birds. The fact that spring would come eventually. The sound of Sophie's voice asking a question she already half knew the answer to. Then I got out of the car and walked inside. Patricia was waiting in the corridor. She had 2 associates with her and a rolling file case that held everything we'd built over 4 months. She looked at me when I came in and said simply, "Ready?" "Yes," I said. Daniel arrived with his attorney 7 minutes before 9. He had dressed carefully, good suit, conservative tie, and he had clearly been coached on his expression, which was attempting something like calm dignity. He didn't look at me directly when he entered the room. His attorney, a man named Whitmore, was well-dressed and confident in the manner of someone who thought the case would be straightforward. He had not read the file. The proceeding was a contested hearing on the grounds for divorce and the preliminary determination of asset division. Daniel's position, presented through Whitmore, was that the marriage had suffered from mutual disconnection and that no specific fault should be attributed. He attempted to frame the situation as a gradual drifting apart. 2 people who had grown in different directions, with no villain and no victim. Patricia waited. She is very good at waiting. When it was our turn, she presented the evidence in chronological order. She did not editorialize. She did not perform. She simply laid it out, document by document, photograph by photograph, financial record by financial record. 6 months of a documented extramarital relationship. Hotel receipts dated to weekends when Daniel had provided false accounts of his whereabouts. Credit card charges at restaurants cross-referenced with the photograph evidence. And the text message. "She doesn't know anything. She never will." Printed cleanly on a single sheet of paper and submitted as Exhibit 14. Whitmore objected to the text message on grounds of how it was obtained. Patricia had anticipated this. Greg Sauer had provided a signed affidavit explaining that the exchange had been visible on a shared screen in a professional setting and that he had documented it of his own volition. The objection was overruled. That was when Daniel's composure started to go. I watched it happen across the room. It was subtle at first, a tightening around his eyes, a slight shift in his posture. Whitmore leaned over and said something to him quietly. Daniel shook his head. Once, sharply. When Whitmore cross-examined me, he tried several angles. He suggested I had been surveilling my husband. He suggested the anonymous source was unreliable. He asked whether I had considered that my own emotional withdrawal from the marriage had contributed to its breakdown. I answered each question directly, without elaboration, without effect. "Mrs. Harmon," he said, "isn't it true that you chose to gather evidence secretly rather than address your concerns openly with your husband?" "Yes," I said. He looked as though he expected more. "I made that choice," I continued, "because the previous occasion on which I raised concerns with my husband, he lied to me. I determined that documentation would be more useful than conversation." Brief silence. "And would you say," Whitmore pressed, "that this level of preparation is consistent with someone acting in good faith?" "I would say," I replied, "that it's consistent with someone who understood what she was dealing with." From the other table, I heard Daniel exhale sharply. His attorney touched his arm. It didn't help. The judge, a woman in her late 50s with the expression of someone who had seen every version of this particular story, asked Daniel's counsel if they wished to present any additional evidence countering the financial records. They did not have additional evidence. The hearing did not resolve everything that day. That's not how family court works, and I want to be accurate. But fault was formally entered into the record. The documented infidelity was acknowledged. The false statements Daniel had made to me about his whereabouts were noted, and the judge's preliminary remarks on asset division were notably different from what Daniel's strategy had anticipated. Whitmore requested a recess. Daniel stood up too fast and knocked his chair back. Several people in the room looked over. Patricia gathered her documents with complete calm. She looked at me once and gave a small, precise nod. I looked straight ahead. The divorce was finalized on a Friday in April. Not a dramatic Friday, an ordinary one. Gray and a little cold, with the particular flatness of early spring before the color comes back. I drove to Patricia's office, signed the final documents at a long conference table, shook Patricia's hand, and drove to pick up Sophie from school. That was it. That was the ending. But the weeks between the February hearing and that Friday had been full of the kind of activity that doesn't look like victory from the inside. It looks like paperwork and phone calls and waiting and more paperwork. I want to account for it honestly, because the story of how you win is mostly the story of those weeks. After the February hearing, Daniel's position collapsed faster than I'd expected. The fault finding had changed the entire landscape of the negotiation. Whitmore, to his credit, recognized quickly that his client's best remaining option was to settle. A protracted court battle would only produce more documentation, more testimony, more exposure. He contacted Patricia within 10 days of the hearing and opened settlement discussions. What I received in the settlement, the house. This was the most important thing to me, not as property, but as Sophie's continuity. Her school, her room, her backyard. Patricia had structured our demand around Sophie's stability, and the court's stated interest in minimizing disruption to the child. And it held. Primary physical custody of Sophie, with Daniel receiving structured visitation on alternating weekends and one weekday evening per week. He did not contest this significantly. I believed, and I still believe, that he understood, on some level, that he had forfeited the moral ground on which a stronger custody argument would have stood. A fair division of our retirement and savings accounts, with additional consideration given to the documented financial diversion, the hotel stays, the dinners, the money spent on an affair that had been conducted partly on our shared income. This was quantified. It was added to the calculation. Spousal support for 3 years, at a level that reflected the income disparity between us and the disruption to my own career trajectory that our domestic arrangement had created over time. My attorney's fees substantially covered. I will not pretend it was everything I could have asked for. No settlement is. There were things I didn't get, concessions that had to be made to reach agreement rather than continue fighting. But the things that mattered, Sophie, the house, financial stability, those were secured. Patricia had done exactly what I'd hired her to do. The day Daniel moved the last of his things out was a Saturday, 3 weeks before the finalization. Sophie was with my mother. I was in the backyard when the movers came, weeding the garden beds I'd been neglecting since October. I heard them in the house, the sound of furniture being shifted, boxes being carried downstairs. I stayed outside. I did not feel the need to watch. When they were gone, Daniel knocked on the back door. I stood up from the garden bed and looked at him through the glass. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him look. He raised his hand in a gesture that was somewhere between a wave and an acknowledgement. Of what, exactly, I wasn't sure. I raised mine back, not warmly, not coldly, simply. He left. I went inside and made a cup of tea and stood at the kitchen window and looked at my backyard. The garden was a mess. I'd neglected it since fall and it showed. But the structure was there. The beds, the border plantings, the climbing rows on the back fence that came back no matter how rough the winter. Things grew back. That was the nature of them. I called Dr. Reeves that evening. I told her the settlement had been reached. She asked me how I felt. Tired, I said, and clear. That sounds right, she said. I also called Diane. She came over with a bottle of wine, and we sat on the porch, even though it was too cold for it, in our coats, and she said, "You did it exactly right." I did what I had to, I said. Same thing, she said. The Thursday group sent me a card. 8 signatures, including a woman named Rosa, who had been in the middle of her own proceedings when I joined and had finalized 2 months before me. Her note said, "The other side is real. You made it." On the Friday the papers were signed, I picked Sophie up from school, and she ran to me in the parking lot with her backpack bouncing and told me she'd learned 3 new dinosaur facts, and had I known that the Ankylosaurus could swing its tail club hard enough to break bone. I told her I had not known that. "It's called a thagomizer," she said. "The tail part. It has a name." "That's a very good word," I said. I buckled her in. I drove home. I turned into the driveway of the house, my house now, and the climbing rose on the back fence was already showing the first tentative green of spring. I thought, this is the other side. Summer came. Sophie turned 9 in June and wanted a dinosaur-themed birthday party, which meant I spent an afternoon painting green scales on paper plates and ordering a custom cake with a fondant Brachiosaurus rising out of it. 8 kids in the backyard, running through the sprinkler, eating too much cake, shrieking. My mother sat on the porch and watched with the particular expression of someone who is filing the moment away. Diane was there too, and it felt like the first real celebration I'd had in a long time. I repainted the porch that July. A slightly darker green than before, a color I had liked for 2 years without ever buying. It looked exactly right. I stood back on the first evening and thought about how small a thing it was, and how much it mattered. Work changed in a way I hadn't expected. The months of the divorce process had made me sharper, more organized, more precise, more willing to advocate for myself in spaces where I'd previously defaulted to accommodation. I applied for a promotion in August. I got it. My salary went up by 19%. My manager told me she'd been waiting for me to apply for 2 years. I joined a book club in the fall. 6 women who liked reading and arguing about it, meeting on the second Tuesday of every month in rotating living rooms with too much wine. I hadn't done something like that in years. I hadn't had time. Now I made time. Dr. Reeves moved me to monthly sessions. I began working through something harder than the acute crisis, the longer history of what I'd accepted without examination, the ways I'd made myself smaller, the questions I'd stopped asking. It was difficult, slower work than the emergency had been, but it was the right work. I began to understand that the life I was building was not simply a replacement for what had been lost. It was something that had always been possible, but had required a rupture to become real. As for Daniel and Melissa, they moved in together. Removed from the secrecy that had sustained it for years, the relationship turned out to be different than either had expected. What functions as passion in a hidden arrangement does not always survive ordinary Tuesday evenings. By autumn, Daniel had taken a pay cut at his firm. His visitation days with Sophie were regular but visibly exhausting. There was a flatness to him I hadn't seen before, the quality of someone adjusting to a life that had turned out smaller than imagined. Melissa had lost most of the friendships from our shared social circle. She had left her job of 6 years and retreated into a quieter, smaller existence. She did not reach out to me again. I did not feel satisfaction when I heard these things. What I felt was closer to quiet acknowledgement, that choices leave marks, and the future tends to be a fair accountant even when the present is not. One Friday evening in October, I sat on the repainted porch with a glass of wine. Sophie was inside doing homework, occasionally calling out a question. The climbing rose had gone dormant for the winter. The house was quiet in the way it is quiet when it belongs entirely to the people inside it. I raised my glass toward nobody in particular, toward October, toward the fact that things grow back. Then I went inside to help my daughter with her homework. That is my story, what I learned. Document before you confront. Build before you act. And never, ever underestimate how much you are capable of when you have no other choice. Betrayal breaks things. But what it breaks makes room for something that was never there before. A life that is fully, honestly yours. If you had been standing in that kitchen, holding that phone, with the soup boiling over, what would you have done? Leave your answer below. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Thank you for listening.